The morning Grace Palmer arrived in White River, South Dakota. The entire saloon fell silent as she ducked through the doorway, her 6'3" frame casting a shadow across the dusty floorboards that stretched longer than any woman's shadow had a right to be. It was September 1878, and she had traveled 3 weeks by wagon train from Missouri, her belongings tied in 2 canvas bags and her hope wearing thinner with each passing mile. The whispers started immediately, just as they had in every town before this one, voices that pretended to be discreet but carried perfectly well to her ears. Lord have mercy, that girl's tall as a fence post. No man's going to want a woman he has to climb a ladder to kiss. It's unnatural, that's what it is. Grace kept her chin level, her green eyes fixed straight ahead as she approached the bar. She had heard it all before, every variation of the same cruel observations that had followed her since she turned 14 and shot up past her father, past her brothers, past every eligible man in 3 counties. Her mother had assured her it would not matter, that the right man would see past her height to the woman beneath. Her mother had been wrong. Grace's mother had died 2 years ago without ever seeing her youngest daughter courted, proposed to, or even asked to dance at a social. The bartender, a squat man with suspicious eyes, looked her up and down with barely concealed disdain. "Help you? I am looking for work," Grace said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I can cook, clean, so keep books. I am a hard worker. We do not need anyone." His dismissal was immediate, final. The boarding house, then, or the general store. Surely someone needs help. Try the widow Morrison. She takes in washerwomen sometimes. He turned away, already done with her. Grace swallowed the lump in her throat and walked back out into the bright Dakota sunshine. White River was not much of a town, just a main street with a handful of buildings clustered around it like nervous sheep, but it was supposed to be her fresh start. Her brothers had pooled their money to send her west, convinced that the frontier would be more forgiving than Missouri, that a woman's practical skills would matter more than her appearance in a place where survival took precedence over society's narrow expectations. They had been wrong, too. She found the widow Morrison's house on the edge of town, a weathered structure that sagged slightly to one side. The widow herself answered the door, a tiny woman who barely reached Grace's chest. Her eyes widened comically as she craned her neck back to look up at Grace's face. "Merciful heavens," the widow breathed. "I am looking for work, madam. The bartender said you might need help with washing." Mrs. Morrison shook her head slowly, still staring. "No, dear. I am sorry, but no, I could not possibly. You would not fit through most of my doors properly." "I just came through your door." "Yes, but barely. And my ceiling is low in the back rooms. You would be hitting your head constantly. I am sorry, but it would not work." The door closed with a gentle but firm click. Grace stood on the porch for a long moment, fighting the burning sensation behind her eyes. She would not cry. She had promised herself when she left Missouri that she would not waste any more tears on something she could not change. Her height was not a moral failing. It was not a choice. It was simply the way God had made her, and if the world could not accept that, then the failing was the world's, not hers. But knowing that did not make it hurt any less. She walked back toward the center of town, trying to formulate a new plan. She had enough money for perhaps 2 weeks of room and board if she could find someone willing to rent to her. After that, she would need to find work or move on again, though she had no idea where she would go. West was running out of room. Soon she would hit the Pacific Ocean, and then what? The sound of raised voices drew her attention to the general store. A man was loading supplies into a wagon, his movements efficient and unhurried despite the store owner who hovered anxiously beside him. "Mr. Northwood, please. I am only saying what folks are thinking. Those winters up in the Black Hills are deadly. A man alone, well, it is not right. You should consider taking a wife, settling closer to town. I like my solitude, Henderson. The man's voice was deep, resonant, the kind of voice that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the chest. But what if something happens? What if you get injured or sick? There would be no one to help you. I will take my chances. Grace found herself staring at the man called Northwood, though she told herself it was rude. He was enormous, easily 6.5 feet tall with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sun. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord, and his arms, visible beneath rolled-up shirt sleeves, were thick with muscle that came from hard physical labor, not idle exercise. A full beard covered the lower half of his face, neatly trimmed but substantial. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone completely comfortable in his own body, unbothered by how much space he took up in the world. Grace felt something twist in her chest, an unfamiliar sensation that took her a moment to identify as envy. How easy it must be to move through the world when you were meant to be large, when your size was considered an asset rather than a defect. As if sensing her gaze, the man looked up. His eyes were startlingly blue, the color of deep water, and for a moment they locked with hers across the dusty street. His expression did not change, but something flickered in those eyes, surprise, perhaps, or curiosity. Then Henderson, the store owner, followed Northwood's gaze and spotted Grace. His mouth pursed in distaste. Good Lord, another oddity. We are becoming quite the collection of curiosities here in White River. Grace felt her face flame, but before she could turn away, Northwood's voice cut through the air like a blade. Mind your tongue, Henderson. The store owner blinked. I am sorry. The lady has done nothing to deserve your discourtesy. Apologize. Mr. Northwood, I meant no harm. Then apologize. Henderson's face went red, but he called across the street, My apologies, miss. I spoke out of turn. Grace nodded stiffly, not trusting her voice. Northwood held her gaze for another moment, then returned to loading his wagon. Henderson retreated into his store, muttering under his breath. Grace hurried away, her heart pounding. She did not know whether to feel grateful or humiliated by Northwood's intervention. She had not asked for his defense, had learned long ago that white knights did not ride to the rescue of women like her. The fact that he had spoken up at all left her feeling strangely unbalanced. She found the town's only boarding house and secured a room for a week, paying in advance. The landlady, Mrs. Chen, was a Chinese woman who had come to South Dakota during the gold rush years and stayed when her husband died. She looked at Grace's height with interest rather than judgment. You are very tall, she observed in accented English. Yes, madam. Is good for reaching high places. You need work, Grace's heart leaped. Yes, I can do almost anything. Can you lift heavy things? I am stronger than I look. Mrs. Chen nodded thoughtfully. I think about it, need help with winter preparation. Lots of work, but I think about it first. It was not a promise, but it was not an outright rejection either. Grace clung to that small mercy as she climbed the narrow stairs to her room, ducking to avoid hitting her head on the low ceiling of the second floor. That night, she lay in the small bed with her feet hanging off the end and allowed herself a few silent tears. She was 23 years old, alone in a strange town, with no prospects and dwindling funds. Every door in her life had been closed because of something she could not control. Every man who might have courted her had looked at her height and seen only an aberration, a woman who violated the natural order by daring to be larger than them. She thought of Northwood, that mountain of a man who had defended her without being asked. She wondered what it would be like to stand beside someone and not feel like a giant, to look at a man and have to tilt her head back instead of down. But that was a foolish thought, and Grace had promised herself she was done with foolish thoughts. She turned her face to the wall and forced herself to sleep. The next morning, she rose early and walked to every business in White River, asking for work. The answer was always the same: no. By afternoon, she was tired, discouraged, and hungry. She had been too anxious to eat breakfast, and now her stomach was growling audibly. She was walking past the livery stable when she heard a commotion inside. A horse was screaming, the sound of hooves striking wood echoing into the street. Grace hesitated, then ducked inside. The stable owner, an older man she had seen around town, was pressed against a stall door, his face white with fear. Inside the stall, a beautiful chestnut mare was rearing and thrashing, her eyes rolling with panic. "What happened?" Grace asked. The stable owner jumped at her voice. "Snake spooked her. Got it out, but she is wild with fear now. She is going to hurt herself if she does not calm down." Grace looked at the terrified horse, at the way she threw herself against the walls of the stall. Without thinking, she unlatched the stall door. "Wait, do not," but Grace was already inside. She had grown up with horses, had always had a way with them. Her brothers used to joke that she was half horse herself, all long legs and nervous energy. "Easy," she murmured, keeping her voice low and soothing. "Easy now, girl, it is gone. You are safe." The mare's ears flicked toward her, but she continued to dance and toss her head. Grace kept talking, kept her movements slow and predictable. She began to hum, an old tune her mother used to sing, and gradually, the horse began to settle. It took 20 minutes, but eventually the mare allowed Grace to approach, to lay a hand on her sweat-soaked neck. Grace continued humming, stroking the soft hide until the horse's breathing slowed to normal. "I will be damned," the stable owner breathed from outside the stall. "I have not seen anyone gentle a horse like that in years." Grace led the mare out of the stall, checking her over for injuries. There were a few scrapes, nothing serious. She found clean water and a rag and began cleaning the wounds, her hands gentle and sure. "You have a gift, miss," the stable owner said. "A real gift." "I have always liked horses better than people," Grace admitted. "They do not care how tall you are." The old man chuckled. "I suppose they do not at that." He paused, watching her work. "You looking for employment?" Grace's heart stuttered. Yes, I am. I could use someone with your touch. The pay is not much, but it is steady. Room in the back if you need it, though the ceiling is not high. I will take it." The words tumbled out before he could change his mind. "When do I start?" "Right now, if you are willing." Grace smiled, the first genuine smile she had managed since arriving in White River. "I am willing." The stable owner, whose name was Thomas Wright, proved to be a fair employer and a kind man. He was getting on in years, he explained, and his joints pained him when the weather turned cold. Having someone young and strong to handle the heavy work would be a blessing. Grace threw herself into the work with grateful enthusiasm, mucking stalls, hauling water, grooming horses, and repairing tack. The physical labor felt good after weeks of travel and rejection. The room in the back of the stable was small and drafty, but it was hers. She moved her few belongings from the boarding house, thanking Mrs. Chen for her kindness. The Chinese woman nodded approvingly. "Good. You find your place. Is important finding where you fit." Grace thought about those words as she settled into her new routine. The horses did not care that she was tall. They did not whisper or stare or turn her away. They accepted her exactly as she was, and in return, she cared for them with all the tenderness she had stored up inside her with no one to give it to. She had been working at the stable for 3 days when Northwood came in, leading his massive draft horse. The animal was limping slightly, favoring its left front leg. "Mr. Right Around?" Northwood asked, his deep voice making the stable feel suddenly smaller. He went to get supplies. "I am Grace Palmer. I work here now." She wiped her hands on her apron and approached the horse, keeping her movements calm. "What happened? Stepped wrong on the trail yesterday. I have been resting him, but he is still tender." Northwood watched as Grace knelt beside the horse, running her hands carefully down the leg. Up close, she could see the calluses on Northwood's hands, the sun-weathered skin, the small scars that came from years of hard mountain living. "I do not feel any heat or swelling," Grace said, gently lifting the hoof. "May I? Go ahead." She examined the hoof carefully, then found the problem a small stone wedged deep in the frog. "Hold him steady." "He is steady." Grace retrieved a hoof pick and worked carefully to dislodge the stone. The horse shifted but did not pull away. When the stone came free, she could see the tender spot it had created. "That was the culprit," she said, showing Northwood the stone. "I will clean it and apply some salve. He should be fine in a day or two, but rest him if you can. I live 2 hours up in the hills. I will stay in town for a few days." Grace nodded and set about treating the horse's hoof. She was acutely aware of Northwood's presence, of how he seemed to fill the entire stable despite standing perfectly still. When she glanced up, she found him watching her with those intense blue eyes. "You are new to White River," he said. It was not a question. "I arrived 4 days ago. From Missouri, and before that Kentucky, and before that Virginia." She finished wrapping the horse's hoof and stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "I have been moving west for a while now. Running from something." Grace met his eyes steadily. "Looking for somewhere I fit." Something shifted in Northwood's expression, a softening around the eyes. "That can be a long search." "Have you found where you fit, Mr. Northwood? Call me Atticus." He stroked his horse's neck, his large hand gentle on the animal's hide. "And yes, the mountains suit me." "Then you are fortunate." They stood in silence for a moment, the stable filled with the quiet sounds of horses eating hay and shifting in their stalls. Grace was acutely aware that she did not have to tilt her head down to look at Atticus's face, that even though he was still several inches taller than her, the difference felt natural rather than jarring. She was used to towering over men, to seeing the tops of their heads, to watching them crane their necks to meet her eyes. With Atticus, she could simply look across. "Wright is lucky to have found you," Atticus said finally. "Not many people have a touch with horses like that." "Horses are easier than people." "Most things are." Grace found herself smiling slightly. "You do not seem like much of a people person yourself, Mr. Northwood." "Atticus," he corrected again. "And no, I am not. That is why I live in the mountains." "Yet you defended me to Henderson." His jaw tightened beneath the beard. "Henderson is a small-minded fool. Someone needed to remind him of his manners. Still, thank you." Atticus nodded once, then pulled a coin from his pocket and handed it to her. Grace looked down at the silver dollar in surprise. "That is too much." "It is what the work is worth." He began leading his horse toward an empty stall. "I will stable him here for 3 days. Can you keep an eye on him?" "Of course." Grace showed him to the stall, brought fresh water and hay, and made note of the boarding arrangements in Mr. Wright's ledger. Atticus paid for the 3 days in advance, then paused at the stable door. "You did well with that mare the other day," he said. "Wright was talking about it at the saloon, said you had magic hands." Grace felt herself flush. "I just understand them. Understanding is its own kind of magic." Atticus settled his hat on his head. "Good day, Miss Palmer." "Grace," she said, surprising herself. "If I am to call you Atticus, you should call me Grace." The corner of his mouth twitched beneath the beard, not quite a smile, but close. "Good day, Grace." He left, and Grace found herself standing in the stable doorway, watching his broad back as he walked up the street toward the boarding house. Something warm had settled in her chest, something she was afraid to examine too closely. Mr. Wright returned an hour later, laden with supplies. He was full of news from town. Apparently, the banker's wife was scandalized that Atticus Northwood had defended Grace so publicly. Certain it indicated some improper interest. Grace felt her face heat as Mr. Wright relayed this gossip with obvious amusement. "Do not pay them any mind," he said kindly. "Small towns breed small minds sometimes. Atticus is a good man, one of the best. He does not talk much, but when he does, he means what he says. If he thought you deserved defending, then you did. I did not ask him to defend me." "No, but he did it anyway. That is the kind of man he is." Mr. Wright began unpacking his supplies. "He comes down from the mountains every few weeks for supplies. Keeps to himself mostly, but folks respect him. He is built like a bear and twice as strong, but I have never seen him use his size to intimidate. Just the opposite, he is the first to help when someone needs it, never asks for anything in return." Grace absorbed this information silently, trying not to show too much interest. She had learned the hard way that hope was a dangerous thing. Men like Atticus Northwood, strong, capable, self-sufficient, did not need complicated women in their lives. They certainly did not need women who drew stares and whispers everywhere they went. But she could not deny that something about him had unsettled her carefully constructed defenses. Maybe it was the way he had looked at her, not down, not with that particular angle that most men adopted, but straight across, as if they were equals meeting on level ground. Or maybe it was simply that he had not stared at her height as if it were a circus attraction, had not made any comment about it at all beyond defending her from Henderson's cruelty. Over the next 3 days, Atticus came by the stable morning and evening to check on his horse. Each visit was brief, professional, but Grace found herself looking forward to them nonetheless. They did not talk much, but there was a comfortable quality to the silence between them, as if they both understood the value of quiet. On the 3rd day, Grace was grooming Atticus's horse when she heard voices outside the stable. She recognized Henderson's nasal tone immediately. "I am just saying, Northwood, it is not right. A woman that size, it is unnatural. And now she is working with animals, which seems fitting, I suppose, but Henderson." Atticus's voice was cold enough to freeze water. "I am going to say this once, and I suggest you listen carefully. Grace Palmer is a skilled, hard-working woman who has done nothing to deserve your commentary. If I hear you speaking about her this way again, you and I are going to have a problem." "I did not mean—" "Yes, you did. That is the issue." There was a pause. "Grace is worth 10 of you on your best day. Remember that." Footsteps approached the stable, and Grace quickly resumed grooming, trying to look as if she had not heard every word. Atticus came in alone, his expression thunderous. "Your horse is healing well," Grace said quietly, not looking at him. "He should be fine to travel tomorrow." "Grace, you do not have to do that." She kept her hands moving over the horse's coat, the rhythmic motion soothing. "Defend me, I mean. I am used to what people say. That does not make it right. No, but fighting every small-minded person in South Dakota would be exhausting." She finally looked at him, surprised to find him closer than she expected, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his dark beard, the lines at the corners of his eyes. "I appreciate the sentiment, but I learned a long time ago that I cannot control what people think of me." "Maybe not," Atticus said slowly. "But that does not mean they should be allowed to speak cruelty without consequence." Grace felt something crack inside her chest, some protective wall she had built up stone by stone over the years. The genuine anger in Atticus's voice, the way he seemed personally offended by Henderson's words, reached past all her defenses to touch something vulnerable and raw. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You do not know me." Atticus was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes searching her face. "I know what it is like to be different," he said finally. "To have people look at you and see only what makes you strange, not what makes you human. And I know how much it costs to keep walking with your head up when the world wants you to bow down and apologize for existing." Grace's throat tightened. "How could you possibly know that? You are exactly what a man is supposed to be. Big, strong, capable. No one looks at you and sees something wrong." "No," Atticus agreed. "They look at me and see something frightening. I am too big, too rough, too comfortable with solitude. Women cross the street when they see me coming. Mothers pull their children close. I have been called beast and savage and worse, and that was before I gave up trying to fit into polite society and moved into the mountains." Grace stared at him, seeing him properly for the first time. The loneliness in his eyes, the careful way he held himself as if constantly aware of how much space he occupied, how easily he could intimidate without meaning to. He was right, they were different sides of the same coin, both too much of something the world wanted them to be less of. "I am sorry," she said softly. "I should not have assumed. We both know what they say about assumptions." Atticus reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His hand was calloused but gentle, and the touch sent electricity down her spine. "For what it is worth, I think you are exactly the right size." "For what?" The corner of his mouth lifted in that almost smile. "For reaching high shelves, for handling large horses, for standing your ground against fools like Henderson." He paused, his hand still hovering near her cheek. "For fitting perfectly against my chest, I would imagine, though I confess I have not tested that theory." Grace's breath caught. She could not remember the last time anyone had flirted with her, if anyone ever truly had. "That seems like a very specific theory, Mr. Northwood." "Atticus." "Atticus." His name felt right in her mouth, solid and strong. "Are you planning to test this theory?" "That depends." His thumb traced the line of her jaw, feather light. "Would you mind if I did?" Grace's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "I suppose I would need to know what the test entails." "Come here." It was not quite a command, not quite a request, but something softer. An invitation. Grace stepped closer, closing the distance between them until they were nearly touching. Even standing straight, her eyes were level with his collarbone. Slowly, carefully, Atticus wrapped his arms around her and drew her against his chest. Grace had been hugged before, but never like this. Never by someone tall enough that she could rest her head against their shoulder. Never by someone whose arms could encircle her completely without awkwardness. Atticus's chest was solid muscle beneath his shirt, warm and steady, and his heart beat a slow rhythm against her ear. His chin rested on top of her head as if it had been made to fit there. "Well," Atticus murmured, his voice rumbling through his chest into her bones, "seems my theory was correct. Perfect fit." Grace closed her eyes, allowing herself to sink into the embrace. For the first time in her adult life, she felt small in the best possible way, not diminished or reduced, but protected, cherished, exactly right. Tears pricked her eyes and she blinked them back furiously. "You are crying," Atticus said, concern threading through his voice. He tried to pull back, but Grace tightened her arms around him. "I am not crying. My eyes are just leaking." She felt his chest shake with silent laughter. "My mistake." They stood like that for a long moment, neither wanting to break the connection. Finally, reluctantly, Grace stepped back. She wiped at her eyes, embarrassed by her reaction but unable to regret it. "I should finish with your horse," she said, her voice unsteady. "Grace." Atticus waited until she looked at him. "Would you have dinner with me tonight?" Yes. Yes, I would like that." "The hotel dining room." 6 o'clock. Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. Atticus held her gaze for another moment, then tipped his hat and left the stable. Grace sagged against the stall door, her legs suddenly weak. "I will be damned," Mr. Wright said from the stable entrance, making Grace jump. She had not realized he had returned. He was grinning broadly. "I have lived in White River for 30 years, and I have never seen Atticus Northwood look at anyone the way he just looked at you." "How did he look at me?" "Like a man who just found water in the desert." Grace touched her face where Atticus's fingers had been, her skin still tingling. "It is just dinner, if you say so." Mr. Wright was still grinning. "But you might want to wear something nice." Grace looked down at her work dress, stained with dirt and horsehair. "I do not have anything nice." "Then I suggest you go visit Mrs. Chen. She is a wizard with a needle, and she keeps a few ready-made dresses for emergencies. Tell her I sent you." Grace hesitated, torn between practicality and hope. She had so little money left, and spending it on a dress seemed frivolous. But the memory of Atticus's arms around her, the warmth in his eyes, made her reckless. "All right," she said. "I will go now if you can spare me." Go. I will manage the stable for a few hours." Mrs. Chen was indeed a wizard with a needle, and she had exactly one dress that would work for Grace's height, a deep green wool that brought out the color of her eyes. It needed slight alterations, which Mrs. Chen made quickly while Grace waited, and cost almost all of Grace's remaining money. But when Grace looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. The dress fit properly, falling to her ankles instead of her calves, the sleeves reaching her wrists, the bodice tailored to her frame. She looked like a woman, not a girl wearing her younger sister's outgrown clothes. "Is beautiful," Mrs. Chen said with satisfaction. "That man, he will not know what hit him." Grace blushed. "It is just dinner." Mrs. Chen made a knowing sound. "Just dinner," she repeated, her tone making clear she did not believe it for a moment. Grace wore the dress back to the stable, too nervous to risk wrinkling it by changing again later. She helped Mr. Wright with the afternoon chores, hyper-aware of the time, of the sun's position in the sky, of the way her stomach fluttered with anticipation and nerves. At 5:45, she washed her face and hands, braided her long brown hair and pinned it up, and walked to the hotel with her heart in her throat. The dining room was modest but clean, with checkered tablecloths and lanterns providing warm light. Atticus was already there, sitting at a corner table, and when he saw her, he stood so quickly he nearly knocked over his chair. "Grace." He said her name like a prayer. "You look beautiful." "Thank you. You look quite presentable yourself." It was an understatement. Atticus had clearly made an effort, wearing what must be his best shirt and vest, his hair neatly combed, his beard freshly trimmed. He looked less like a wild mountain man, and more like what he truly was, a gentleman who happened to prefer the wilderness to civilization. He pulled out her chair, and Grace sat, overwhelmingly aware of the other diners watching them. An enormous bearded man and an unusually tall woman made quite the pair, and the whispers started immediately. Grace tried to ignore them, focusing instead on Atticus's face as he settled across from her. "Ignore them," Atticus said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Let them talk. They will anyway. Does it not bother you? It did once. Then I realized I could either live my life trying to please people who would never be pleased, or I could live for myself." He leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. "The mountains do not care if I am too big or too quiet. The sky does not judge me for preferring my own company. That is freedom, Grace. Real freedom. It sounds lonely. Sometimes, he admitted. But lonely is better than constantly trying to make yourself smaller to fit into spaces you were never meant to occupy. The server came and took their order's stew for both of them, and fresh bread. When she left, Grace folded her hands on the table, gathering her courage. "Why did you ask me to dinner, Atticus?" He met her eyes steadily. "Because I have not been able to stop thinking about you since the moment I saw you. Because when Henderson spoke about you with such contempt, I wanted to throttle him. Because when I held you in the stable, you fit against me like you were made to be there." He paused. "And because I saw something in your eyes that I recognized, that particular kind of weariness that comes from fighting the same battle every day and losing." That is a very honest answer. I am not much good at pretty lies. I prefer honesty. Grace took a breath. "I am 23 years old, and you are the first man who has ever asked me to dinner. The first man who has ever looked at me like I might be something other than a cautionary tale or a curiosity. I do not know what to do with that." "You do not have to do anything with it," Atticus said gently. "We can just eat dinner and talk and see where the evening leads. No expectations." But Grace could see in his eyes that he was lying, at least a little. There were expectations, hopes, possibilities hanging in the air between them like lantern light. She found she did not mind. They talked through dinner, the conversation flowing more easily than Grace had expected. Atticus told her about his cabin in the Black Hills, about the work he did trapping and hunting, about the brutal beauty of winter in the mountains. Grace told him about Missouri, about her family, about the series of towns that had rejected her before she landed in White River. "Your family let you travel alone?" Atticus asked, frowning. "They wanted me to have a chance at a life. They thought the frontier might be different." Grace pushed her stew around with her spoon. "My mother used to say that God makes everyone for a purpose, and my purpose would reveal itself when I found the right place. She died believing that. I am not sure I share her faith. Maybe you just have not found the right place yet. Maybe there is no right place. Maybe I am just always going to be wrong for wherever I am." Atticus reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was warm, rough with calluses, and completely engulfed hers. "Or maybe you have been looking in the wrong places. And where are the right places?" "Come to the mountains with me." Grace stared at him. "What? Come to the mountains, tomorrow, just for a day," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "Let me show you what I am talking about. Let me show you a place where being tall is an advantage, where strength matters more than fitting into some narrow idea of what a woman should be." "Atticus, we just met." "I know. And if you say no, I will respect that. But Grace, I have lived 30 years without meeting anyone who understood what it means to take up too much space in the world. And then you walked into White River, and I saw myself reflected in your eyes." His grip on her hand tightened. "I am not asking you to marry me or make any promises. I am just asking for one day. One day to show you what freedom could look like." Grace's practical side screamed that this was reckless, that she barely knew this man, that going into the mountains alone with him was dangerous and improper and foolish. But her heart, that battered, bruised thing that had been kicked so many times, was begging her to say yes, to take the risk, to reach for something she had never dared to want. "One day," she said finally. Atticus's face broke into a genuine smile, the first she had seen from him, and it transformed his entire face. He was handsome in a rough, weathered way, but when he smiled, he was nearly beautiful. "One day," he agreed. "I promise I will have you back before dark." They finished their dinner in comfortable silence, neither wanting to break the fragile magic of the evening. When Atticus walked Grace back to the stable, the autumn night was cool and clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds. At the stable door, Atticus paused. "Thank you for tonight," he said. "Thank you for asking me." They stood close enough that Grace could feel the warmth radiating from his body. She wanted him to kiss her, wanted it with a ferocity that surprised her, but Atticus just tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and stepped back. "I will come by at dawn," he said. "Dress warm." Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. She watched him walk away, then went into the stable and leaned against the door, her heart racing. Mr. Wright emerged from the back room, smirking. "Good dinner, very good." "He is taking you to the mountains tomorrow, is he not?" Grace blinked. "How did you know?" "Because that is what I would do if I were him. Show you his world, let you see why he loves it." Mr. Wright crossed his arms, his expression turning serious. "Atticus is a good man, Grace. One of the best. But the mountains are his life. If something develops between you two, you need to understand that. Nothing is developing, it is just a day trip." Mr. Wright chuckled. "If you say so." Grace barely slept that night, too keyed up with anticipation and nerves. She rose before dawn, dressed in her most practical clothes, and braided her hair tightly. When Atticus arrived with his horse, fully healed and ready to travel, Grace was waiting. He had brought a second horse, a sturdy mare with kind eyes. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes." "Not well, but well enough." Atticus helped her mount, his hands steady on her waist, and Grace was struck again by how natural it felt to be touched by him, how his hands seemed to know exactly where to hold her without awkwardness. They rode out of White River as the sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The journey into the Black Hills took 2 hours. Atticus led them along trails that Grace would never have found on her own, paths that wound between pine trees and granite outcroppings, climbing steadily higher. The air grew cooler and cleaner, sharp with the scent of pine and earth. Grace found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the ride, the quiet broken only by birdsong and the sound of their horses' hooves on stone. "It is beautiful," she said as they emerged into a meadow carpeted with late-blooming wildflowers. "Wait," Atticus said. They rode for another hour, climbing higher, until they broke through the tree line onto a rocky outcropping. Atticus dismounted and helped Grace down, then led her to the edge. Grace's breath caught. Spread out below them was a vista of such staggering beauty that she felt tears spring to her eyes. Mountains rolled away in every direction, their peaks touched with early snow, valleys filled with mist and shadow. The sky was so blue it hurt to look at, and the air so clear she felt she could see forever. "This is why I stay," Atticus said quietly, standing beside her. "This is what I meant about freedom." Grace understood. Up here, the smallness of town gossip and society's expectations seemed laughable. What did it matter if she was tall, if Henderson disapproved, if the world thought she was strange? The mountains did not care. The sky did not judge. Here she could simply be. "Thank you for showing me this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Atticus moved closer until they were standing shoulder to shoulder, both of them gazing out at the vista. "My cabin is about an hour from here," he said. "Would you like to see it?" Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. They remounted and continued deeper into the mountains. When they finally reached Atticus's cabin, Grace was impressed despite herself. It was larger than she expected, solidly built with chinked logs and a stone chimney. A small stream burbled nearby, and a garden plot showed signs of careful tending, though most of the plants had finished for the season. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean, everything practical and well-made. A large bed dominated one corner, covered with what looked like a bearskin. A stone fireplace took up most of one wall, and shelves held supplies, books, and a few carved wooden figures. "You made these?" Grace asked, picking up a carving of a wolf. helps pass the winter evenings. Atticus was building a fire, his movements efficient. I am not much of an artist, but I do my best. They are beautiful. He looked up at her, his blue eyes intense in the dim cabin light. Grace, I need to be honest with you about something. Grace's stomach clenched. Here it came, the catch, the reason this was all too good to be true. All right. I brought you up here because I wanted you to see this place, yes, but also because I wanted you to understand what I am offering if you are interested. He straightened, dusting off his hands. I am not a sophisticated man. I do not have much in the way of money or prospects beyond this cabin and the work I do. But I am a hard worker and I am loyal, and I have enough to live comfortably if not extravagantly. Atticus, what are you saying? He crossed the cabin to stand in front of her, so close she could feel the heat of him. I am saying that I am 30 years old, and I have never met anyone who fits the way you fit. I am saying that watching you walk away after one day would be one of the hardest things I have ever done. And I am saying that if you wanted to stay, if you wanted to see if this thing between us is real, I would count myself the luckiest man in South Dakota. Grace's heart was hammering. You are talking about courting. I am talking about courting, yes. With the intention of marriage if things work out. He reached up and cupped her face with both hands, his palms rough and warm against her cheeks. I know it is fast. I know we barely know each other. But Grace, I have lived alone for a long time and I have never wanted to share my life with anyone until now. That has to mean something. It means you are either very brave or very foolish, Grace whispered. Maybe both. His thumb stroked her cheekbone. What do you say? Will you let me court you properly? Grace thought about White River, about the stable and Mr. Wright's kindness. She thought about Missouri and all the places she had been turned away. She thought about her mother's faith that there was a place for everyone, a purpose for every life. And she thought about how she felt standing in Atticus's arms, like she had finally found the spot in the world that had been waiting for her all along. Yes, she said. Yes, I will let you court me. Atticus's smile was like the sunrise, slow and warm and full of light. He leaned down, giving her time to pull away, and kissed her softly. Grace had never been kissed before, but she found herself responding instinctively, rising on her toes to close the last few inches between them, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders. The kiss deepened, grew more urgent. Atticus's arms came around her, pulling her flush against him, and Grace made a small sound of surprise and pleasure. He broke the kiss, breathing hard, his forehead resting against hers. I should stop, he said, his voice rough. Why? Because you deserve to be courted properly. Because I do not want to rush this. He pulled back, though she could see the effort it cost him. Because when we finally come together, I want it to be right. Grace's face flamed, but she nodded. You are right. Of course you are right. Though it is damned hard to be right when you look at me like that. Like what? Like you want me as much as I want you. Grace swallowed hard. I do want you. That probably makes me improper. That makes you honest. Atticus kissed her forehead, a chaste touch that somehow felt more intimate than their earlier kiss. Come on. Let me show you the rest of my land before I forget myself entirely. They spent the afternoon exploring Atticus's property. He showed her where he hunted, where the best fishing spots were, where wild berries grew in the summer. He talked about his plans to expand the cabin, maybe build a barn, possibly start trapping more seriously if he needed extra income. And with every word, Grace could picture herself there, could see a future unfurling like a map. I would need to give Mr. Wright notice, she said as they sat by the stream, eating the lunch Atticus had packed. He has been kind to me. I would not want to leave him without help. Of course. Atticus was watching her with those intense blue eyes. Take whatever time you need. I will come down to White River once a week, court you properly. Let people see that my intentions are honorable. People are going to talk either way. Let them talk." He reached over and took her hand, threading their fingers together. "I stopped caring what people thought a long time ago. All I care about is what you think." Grace looked at their joined hands, at the way his completely engulfed hers, and felt something settle deep in her chest. "I think I am terrified," she admitted. "I think this is happening too fast, and I do not know you well enough, and a sensible woman would walk away. But I also think I have never been happier than I am right now, sitting by this stream with you. Then maybe you should stop being sensible." "My mother would be scandalized." "Your mother wanted you to find your place. Maybe this is it." Grace squeezed his hand. "Maybe it is." They rowed back to White River in the late afternoon, arriving just as the sun was setting. Atticus walked Grace to the stable, both of them reluctant to part. "I will be back in a week," he promised. "Will you write to me if you need anything? I do not have your address." "General Delivery, Deadwood. They know me there." He cupped her face again, that gesture already becoming familiar and beloved. "Think about everything you saw today. Think about whether you could be happy there. I already know I could be. Then think about whether you could be happy with me." Grace rose on her toes and kissed him, a quick, fierce kiss that held all the words she was not ready to say yet. "I will see you in a week." She watched him ride away, then turned to find Mr. Wright standing in the stable doorway, arms crossed, looking insufferably pleased with himself. "Not one word," Grace warned. "Would not dream of it." He paused. "Though I will say that if Atticus Northwood asked you to marry him, you could do a whole lot worse. He asked to court me. Same thing in Atticus's case. That man does not do anything halfway." Grace floated through the next week in a daze of happiness and anticipation. She threw herself into her work at the stable, helping Mr. Wright prepare for winter, repairing tack and organizing supplies. The townspeople continued to stare and whisper, but for the first time, Grace found she did not care. Let them stare. She had seen the mountains. She had tasted freedom. And she had found a man who looked at her like she hung the moon. Atticus returned exactly 1 week later, riding into town just after dawn. Grace was mucking stalls when she heard his horse, and she dropped the pitchfork and ran out to meet him, all dignity forgotten. He caught her in his arms, lifting her clean off the ground, and kissed her breathless. "Missed you," he rumbled against her mouth. "Missed you too." He set her down but kept his arms around her. "Get cleaned up. I am taking you to breakfast." They ate at the hotel dining room again, ignoring the stares and whispers. Atticus was attentive and charming, asking about her week, telling her about his. After breakfast, they walked to the general store so Atticus could stock up on supplies, and Grace helped him carry packages back to his wagon. Henderson was there, his expression pinched with disapproval. "Northwood, Miss Palmer." "Henderson," Atticus said coolly, "I see you two are making quite the spectacle of yourselves. We are eating breakfast and buying supplies, hardly scandalous. You know what I mean, people are talking." "People always talk." Atticus loaded another bag into his wagon. "Good thing neither of us cares." Henderson's face reddened. "You are being reckless, Northwood. That woman is not suitable. Finish that sentence and you will regret it." Atticus's voice was deadly quiet, and something in his eyes made Henderson step back. "Grace is worth 10 of anyone in this town, including me. If you cannot speak of her with respect, do not speak of her at all." Henderson muttered something under his breath and retreated into his store. Grace touched Atticus's arm, feeling the tension coiled in his muscles. "He is not worth your anger. No one speaks about you that way." Atticus took a breath, clearly trying to calm himself. "No one." Grace felt her throat tighten with emotion. She had spent her whole life being dismissed, overlooked, and insulted. Having someone defend her so fiercely, so completely, was overwhelming. "Thank you," she whispered. Atticus pulled her into his arms, right there on the street in front of God and everyone. "You never have to thank me for treating you the way you deserve to be treated." They spent the day together, walking along the river, talking about everything and nothing. Atticus told her more about his past. He had grown up in Ohio, the youngest of 6 sons. His size had always made him stand out, and not in good ways. People feared him, assumed he was stupid or violent because he was large. He had tried to make it work in cities, tried to find a place where he belonged, but everywhere he went, people saw a monster. "So I came west," he said as they sat on the riverbank. "Figured if I was going to be treated like a wild animal, I might as well live like one. Turns out the wilderness suits me. You ever miss people? Sometimes. Not often." He picked up a stone and skipped it across the water. "What about you? Do you think you would miss town life?" Grace considered the question seriously. "I think I would miss Mr. Wright. He has been kind to me, but the rest of it? No, I will not miss the stares or the whispers or the constant feeling that I am taking up too much space." "You could never take up too much space. You have to say that. You are courting me. I do not have to say anything." Atticus turned to face her fully. "Grace, you are exactly who you are supposed to be, tall and strong and capable. The world is wrong for trying to make you smaller, not the other way around." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "How do you always know the right thing to say?" "I do not. I just say what is true." They kissed there by the river, long and sweet, until Grace pulled away, breathing hard. "We should get back before I forget myself," she said. Atticus groaned but nodded. "You are going to be the death of me, woman." "I certainly hope not. I have plans for you." His eyes darkened with heat. "Is that so? Many plans? Tell me." Grace blushed but held his gaze. "I want to learn everything about you. I want to wake up next to you and fall asleep in your arms. I want to build a life with you in those mountains, and I want to be so happy that we forget the rest of the world exists." "Grace," Atticus breathed. "Are you saying what I think you are saying?" "I am saying that I do not want to wait. I am saying that I am 23 years old and I have spent my whole life waiting for something to begin, and I am tired of waiting." She took his large, calloused hands in hers. "Marry me, Atticus. Marry me and take me to the mountains, and let me spend the rest of my life fitting perfectly against your chest." Atticus stared at her for a long moment, his blue eyes searching her face. Then he let out a whoop of joy that startled birds from the trees and kissed her so hard she saw stars. "Yes," he said when he finally released her. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married 3 days later by the circuit preacher, a hurried ceremony with Mr. Wright and Mrs. Chen as witnesses. Grace wore her green dress and carried wildflowers that Atticus had picked that morning. Atticus wore his best clothes and could not stop smiling, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Atticus picked Grace up and spun her around, laughing. "My wife," he kept saying. "My wife." Grace laughed and cried at the same time, overwhelmed by the sudden, dizzying turn her life had taken. 1 month ago, she had arrived in White River with nothing but her bags and her failing hope. Now she was married to a mountain man who looked at her like she was precious, who defended her like a warrior, who made her feel like she had finally found home. They spent their wedding night in the cabin, and Grace discovered that fitting against Atticus's chest was only the beginning of how perfectly they fit together. He was gentle and passionate by turns, treating her like she was both fragile and unbreakable, and when she finally fell asleep in his arms, she had never felt safer or more cherished. The next morning, Grace woke to find Atticus already up, cooking breakfast over the fire. He turned when he heard her stir, his face breaking into that sunrise smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Northwood." Grace felt a thrill at the name. "Good morning, husband." They ate breakfast together, then spent the day organizing the cabin. Grace had brought her few possessions from the stable, and Atticus made space for them with obvious pleasure. He showed her where everything was, how the cabin worked, what supplies they had, and what they would need. "Winter will be hard," he warned. "We will be snowed in for months. It is just us and the mountains." Sounds perfect. You might change your mind when you are staring at my ugly face for the 100th day in a row. Grace laughed and kissed him. "Your face is not ugly, and I do not think I will ever tire of looking at it." The first weeks of their marriage passed in a haze of happiness and hard work. Grace learned the rhythms of mountain life, chopping wood, hauling water, preserving food, preparing for winter. Atticus proved to be an excellent teacher, patient and thorough, and Grace discovered she loved the physical work, loved the way her body grew stronger, loved the satisfaction of a job well done. She also discovered she loved being married to Atticus. He was affectionate and attentive, always touching her in small ways, a hand on her back as he passed, fingers brushing her hair from her face, arms around her waist while she cooked. At night, he held her close, and Grace found she slept better than she ever had in her life. "I was so lonely," she admitted one night as they lay tangled together. "I did not realize how lonely until now, when I am not anymore." Atticus kissed her temple. "I know what you mean. I told myself I preferred solitude, but I think I was just making the best of what I had. This is better." "You are better. We are better," Grace corrected. "Together." The first snow came in late October, and Grace watched in wonder as the world turned white. Atticus had been right. They were snowed in, the trails impassable, the cabin their entire universe. But Grace found she did not mind. They spent their days working, reading, talking. Atticus taught her to carve, and Grace proved to have a talent for it. She taught him songs her mother had sung, and Atticus's deep voice blended beautifully with her alto. On Christmas, Atticus presented her with a carved box he had made in secret, and Grace gave him a new shirt she had sewn. They ate a feast of roasted venison and potatoes and danced by firelight to music only they could hear. "Are you happy?" Atticus asked as they swayed together. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be. No regrets." Grace pulled back to look at him. "Not one. You, only that I did not find you sooner." The winter passed slowly but sweetly. Grace learned to read the weather, to predict when storms were coming, to track animals by their prints in the snow. She grew stronger, more confident, more comfortable in her own skin. And she fell deeper in love with her husband with every passing day. In February, Grace realized she was pregnant. She was not sure at first, but when her monthly courses failed to come for the second time, she knew. She waited until they were having dinner to tell Atticus, nervous about his reaction. "I have something to tell you," she said, her heart pounding. Atticus looked up from his plate. "What is it?" I am fairly certain I am going to have a baby." Atticus went very still. "A baby?" "Yes. In late summer, I think." For a moment, Grace was afraid he was upset. Then Atticus was out of his chair and sweeping her into his arms, laughing and crying at the same time. "A baby," he kept saying. "We are going to have a baby." "You are happy, happy, Grace. I am over the moon." He set her down carefully as if she were made of glass. "Are you all right? Do you need anything? Should you be sitting down?" Grace laughed at his sudden anxiety. "I am fine. I am healthy and strong, and pregnancy is natural. I do not need to be coddled." "But Atticus," she took his face in her hands, "I will be fine. We will be fine. All of us." He kissed her softly, reverently. "I am going to be a father. You are going to be an excellent father." As her pregnancy progressed, Atticus became increasingly protective. Grace found it endearing and exasperating in equal measure. He would not let her chop wood or carry heavy buckets. He insisted she rest more, eat more, take better care of herself. When her belly began to swell, he marveled at it, talking to their child through her skin, his big hands gentle on her stomach. "You think they will be tall like us?" he asked one night. "Probably. With our genetics, the poor thing does not have much choice." "Good, let them be tall. Let them be strong. Let them know from the beginning that they are exactly right the way they are." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "You are going to be such a good father. I am going to try my damnedest." In May, when the snow finally melted and the trails opened, Atticus insisted they go to White River so Grace could be checked by a doctor. They made the journey slowly, Atticus hovering anxiously the entire time. The doctor proclaimed Grace and the baby perfectly healthy. "You are built for childbearing, Mrs. Northwood. I do not foresee any complications." They stayed in town for a few days, visiting with Mr. Wright and Mrs. Chen, who were both delighted by the news of the baby. Mr. Wright had hired a new stable hand, a young man from Minnesota, and the stable was thriving. Mrs. Chen had knitted a blanket for the baby, and she pressed it into Grace's hands with tears in her eyes. "You come back after baby is born," she insisted. "Let me see." "We will," Grace promised. They returned to the mountains, and Grace settled into the final months of her pregnancy. Summer in the Black Hills was glorious, all wildflowers and sunshine. Grace's belly grew enormous, and she felt like a ship in full sail, ungainly but proud. Atticus thought she was beautiful, told her so constantly, and Grace found herself believing him. In late August, her labor began. Atticus, who had faced down bears and survived blizzards without flinching, turned white with fear. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice cracking. "You stay calm," Grace said through gritted teeth. "And you help me." The labor was long and difficult, but Grace was strong, and Atticus never left her side. He held her hand, wiped her face, whispered encouragement when she was sure she could not go on. And when their son finally slipped into the world, red-faced and wailing, Atticus wept openly. "A boy," he breathed, staring at the tiny creature in his arms. "We have a son." Grace, exhausted but elated, reached for the baby. Atticus placed him carefully in her arms, and Grace looked down at her son's face, already so loved. "What should we name him?" she asked. "Whatever you want." Grace thought of her journey, of all the closed doors and harsh words, of the moment she had walked into White River and seen Atticus for the first time. She thought of how her life had changed, how love had found her when she had stopped looking for it. "James," she said, "after my father." "James William Northwood." "James," Atticus repeated, testing the name. "It is perfect. He is perfect." Their son was indeed perfect, at least to them. He had Atticus's dark hair and Grace's green eyes, and from the beginning it was clear he would be tall. Grace recovered quickly from the birth, her strong body bouncing back with admirable resilience. Atticus proved to be a doting father, changing nappies and walking the floor at night when James could not sleep, singing lullabies in his deep, rumbling voice. Watching her husband with their son, Grace felt her heart swell with love so intense it was almost painful. This was what she had been waiting for all those years. Not just a home or acceptance, but a family of her own, people who loved her exactly as she was, a place where she belonged completely. When James was 3 months old, they made the journey back to White River to show him off. Mrs. Chen cooed over the baby, and Mr. Wright declared him the finest infant in all of South Dakota. Even Henderson, when he saw them on the street, had the grace to nod politely, though his expression was still pinched. "How are you finding married life?" Mr. Wright asked Grace while Atticus was buying supplies. "It is everything I hoped it would be and more. You look happy, truly happy." "I am." Grace looked down at James, sleeping peacefully in her arms. "I spent so long thinking I was wrong, that there was something broken about me. But I was not wrong. I just needed to find the right place and the right person. And you found both. I found both. They returned to the mountains and life settled into a peaceful rhythm. James grew quickly, a sturdy baby with a strong set of lungs and an adventurous spirit. Grace loved watching Atticus with their son, loved the way his huge hands could be so gentle, loved the pride in his eyes when James reached each new milestone. When James was a year old, Grace found herself pregnant again. This time, she was less surprised and more prepared. Their daughter was born the following summer, a calm baby with Atticus's blue eyes and Grace's height even as an infant. She was long and lean. They named her Margaret, after Grace's mother, and called her Maggie. She and James were as different as night and day, where James was boisterous and energetic. Maggie was thoughtful and quiet. But they adored each other, and watching them play together filled Grace with contentment. The years passed quickly, marked by seasons and milestones. James learned to walk, then run, then climb anything he could reach. Maggie followed more slowly but with determination. Grace taught them to read and write, to cook and sew, to understand the natural world around them. Atticus taught them to track and hunt, to respect the wilderness, to be strong and kind. When James was 5 and Maggie 3, Grace discovered she was pregnant for a third time. This pregnancy was harder than the others, and Grace found herself exhausted more easily. Atticus insisted she rest more, taking over many of her usual chores and caring for the children while she slept. Their third child, another son they named Thomas, was born in early spring. He was the smallest of their children but no less loved, and he had a sweet temperament that made him easy to care for. Grace recovered more slowly from this birth, and she and Atticus agreed that 3 children were enough. "We have our hands full as it is," Grace said, watching Thomas nurse while James and Maggie played nearby. "I think this is our complete family." "It is a good family," Atticus said, his arm around her shoulders. "The best family." Grace leaned into him, fitting perfectly against his chest, exactly as she had that first day in the stable. "Do you remember when we met? When Henderson was being cruel and you defended me? I remember. Did you know then that we would end up here?" Atticus was quiet for a moment, considering. "I knew you were special. I knew I wanted to know you better, but I could not have imagined how perfect it would be, how right." "They said I was too tall for any man," Grace murmured. "My whole life that is what I heard. Too tall, too strange, too much. You were never too much." Atticus kissed the top of her head. "You were exactly right. You just needed a mountain man to see it." Grace smiled, closing her eyes, letting herself bask in the warmth of her family. She thought of the girl she had been, arriving in White River with nothing but hope and determination. She thought of all the doors that had closed, all the people who had rejected her. And she thanked God for every single rejection, because each one had led her here, to this moment, to this man, to this life. "I love you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I love you too." Atticus tightened his arm around her. "Always." The children grew, and the years passed in a blur of happiness. James became a skilled hunter and tracker, following in his father's footsteps. Maggie developed a gift for healing, able to set bones and treat illnesses with a steady hand and calm demeanor. Thomas, the youngest, loved books and learning, and Grace spent hours teaching him everything she knew. They made regular trips to White River, maintaining friendships and trading for supplies. Grace watched the town change over the years. New buildings went up, new people arrived, and gradually, the stares and whispers about her height faded. She was just Mrs. Northwood now, Atticus's wife, mother of 3, a respected member of the community despite living in the mountains. Mr. Wright grew old and eventually passed away, leaving the stable to his assistant. Mrs. Chen remained a dear friend, and she and Grace exchanged letters regularly. Even Henderson, in his old age, softened somewhat, once commenting that Grace and Atticus's children were a credit to them both. When James turned 18, he announced his intention to strike out on his own, to see the world beyond the Black Hills. Grace's heart ached at the thought of him leaving, but she understood. He had grown up with the freedom of the mountains, and he needed to find his own path, just as she had. "You come back whenever you want," she told him on the day he left. "This is always your home." "I know, Ma." James, now taller than even his father, hugged her tightly. "I will be back, I promise." He kept his promise, returning often to visit. He eventually settled in Deadwood, working as a guide for hunting parties, and married a kind woman who did not mind that he towered over her. Maggie married a doctor and moved to Rapid City, where she worked alongside her husband. Thomas surprised them all by becoming a teacher, opening a school in White River that welcomed all children, regardless of their differences. Grace and Atticus grew old together in their mountain cabin, their love deepening with each passing year. Atticus's hair turned silver, and Grace's back developed a slight stoop. But they were still strong, still healthy, still deeply in love. On their 30th wedding anniversary, they sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains. Their grandchildren were visiting James's 2 sons, Maggie's daughter, Thomas's young twins, and the cabin was filled with noise and laughter. "You ever regret it?" Atticus asked, his arm around Grace's shoulders in that familiar, comfortable way. "Giving up town life for the mountains?" Grace looked at her husband, at his weathered face and kind eyes, at the silver in his hair and the strength still evident in his frame. She thought of their children and grandchildren, of the life they had built together, of 30 years of happiness and love. "Not for one single moment," she said, leaning into him, fitting perfectly against his chest just as she always had. "This is exactly where I was meant to be, with you, always with you." Atticus kissed her softly, a gesture so familiar it felt like coming home. "You were never too tall, Grace. You were exactly the right size for a mountain man's arms." Grace smiled, closing her eyes, letting the sounds of her family wash over her. She had spent the first 23 years of her life feeling wrong, feeling broken, feeling like she would never find where she belonged. But she had been wrong about being wrong. She had simply needed to find her mountain, her man, her home, and she had found all 3. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Grace Palmer Northwood sat surrounded by the family she and Atticus had built, in the home they had made, in the mountains that had given them freedom. She was exactly where she was meant to be, exactly who she was meant to be, loved exactly as she was. She had fit perfectly against his chest from that very first embrace, and 30 years later, she fit there still. And she always would, for all the days of her life. Their story had begun with rejection and loneliness, with a woman too tall and a man too large for the world to understand. But it had become something beautiful, something lasting, something true. Grace had found her place. She had found her person. She had found her home. And she had never been happier in her entire life.